Never miss a beat. My name is George Perry. I'm an independent writer and also a sport performance coach in Houston, Texas. About 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, I was investigating another story, and I reconnected over the course of a couple conversations with Dave Scott Thomas. Dave was the head coach of cross country and track and field at the University of Guelph for over 25 years. He was an Athletics Canada coach and had produced and coached many of Canada's top runners. And I was vaguely familiar with the fact that he had been very publicly fired and was the front page news in Canada for all the wrong reasons back in 2019 and 2020. And he and I reconnected in 2023. And it was the first time we had spoken in several years. Almost in the exact same week, I reached out to the former CEO of the organization that presents the New York City Marathon, the largest marathon in the United States, Michael Capiraso. I knew that he had been publicly fired in 2020, but I didn't really know too much about it. So I reached out to him to ask him some questions on this other story I was pursuing. I spoke to Dave and Michael within a week or two of each other 3 years ago, and I quickly forgot about that story I was looking into. Hearing from them about what happens to you, to your life, when you are on the cover of your national newspaper of record with some of the most damning social epithets and transgressions above your photo, I was floored. And what I wanted to know and what I couldn't wrap my head around was, why was I hearing it on a phone call and not hearing these conversations on Rogan? Why was I not reading about it in the free press or any of our other heterodox independent media? And the more I dug into this topic, the more I examined this phenomenon, the more convinced I was that we were entirely missing the real story of cancellations. We are really missing the entire story of what happened to people that went through this. So I started talking to anyone I could who had any piece in this story: clinicians, researchers, lawyers, ethicists, everyone. One of the first people Michael told me about was Dr. Christine Marie. He heard her on a podcast and he said, she's the only person that really gets it. She gets it inside and out. So I reached out to her in late 2023. We spoke for the first time. I was looking into lawyers because I want to understand the legal dimensions of this, both in the US and Canada. And I found Jonah Arnold, who is joining us today from Copenhagen. And he and I have spoken and exchanged many emails over the years on some of the legal issues. And one thing that's emerged recently in our conversations with Dave and Michael and a few others is their cancellation started as workplace mobbings. It started in the workplace, and then through one reason or another, through one mechanism or another, the media got a hold of it and they blew it up. It went thermonuclear. To reference back to Catherine's graphic yesterday, it went from that community level to the society level with just instant, devastating consequences. So I'm going to pass it off right now to Dr. Christine Marie to talk about why the media element of this phenomenon is so particularly devastating and damning, and she'll take it from there. Thank you.
So when you experience a trauma, let's suppose it's an interpersonal trauma or a physical trauma like a car accident, you have the ability to look back and think about what happened and use the present as a safe space to heal. The trauma is history facing or backward facing. When you are traumatized by things that are crushing to your reputation and your ability to survive in the media, that is forward facing. That means you are in the war, but you are still being shot. So how can you heal when the wounds keep on coming? Because it is forward-facing in a few ways. Number one, the digital world is potentially permanent, the things that are said about you. Number two, you're powerless. In a workplace mobbing setting, it seems as if there are opportunities for you to go to an influential person and stop the process in some situations. But when it jumps from a contained environment into the entire world, you are left without any way to change the narrative, and it could impact your entire life. Let's talk about not just about your reputation, but your ability to have relationships in the future, your friends, your sense of safety. I mean, when you are the target of something like this, people in the public, I mean, I've worked with many people who've gone through this, but sometimes people in the public are psychologically unwell, and they dox you. They post your private information online, and the story about you that is false continues. Then you have the narrative identity, the stories that you've told yourself your whole life about who you are now being sabotaged by a new narrative that is not who you are. And it's very difficult for that kind of a trauma to not leak through to your sense of self. You're being told that you intentionally ran over a dog with puppies. And you know you never did that. But when you're hearing it 20,000 times repeated online, and that's what people think about you, you start saying, what is wrong with me that they would say these things? In the DSM-5, the diagnostic criteria for PTSD A says exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: witnessing it, directly experiencing it, vicariously, or experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events, like if you're a first responder. But then there's a note at the end of number 4, and the note says, criterion A4 does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television, movies, pictures, unless it's work-related. So you are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, more likely complex post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and it doesn't match a diagnosis criteria for PTSD. And why is that? Because when this happens to you, the wounds that keep happening to you, they're not triggers. Like you see another comment, another article, it does trigger you, but it's also a new wound. So you don't know if you can answer your email because it might wound you. So that's what I mean by forward-facing. For the rest of your life, you have to worry, will this person that I meet have read about me on the internet? And it puts your life, your sense of self, and your life in terms of the desire to live at risk.
So on that note of narrative sabotage, Michael, that's a component of the story that brings you here today, that when the media got hold of the workplace mobbing that was coming after you, the character, the nature, and everything about the accusations changed. And so it not only expanded, but it mutated in your case. Can you just kind of talk about that process a little bit, that the media not only magnified it, but it targeted everything specifically on you in a way that even your coworkers and colleagues didn't do?
Yeah, so what starts as a workplace mobbing turns into a devastation beyond belief. And I think one of the really wonderful things about what we're talking about this conference is the ramifications of workplace mobbing have many threads and can really be exploded into what are situations that are devastating to people beyond the workplace, which a lot of us experienced. But what happens is what is somewhat what you think contained, although it doesn't feel like it at the time because you're being mobbed in the workplace, all of a sudden there are a bunch of anonymous people that decide to go public and create a digital footprint that now becomes part of your life forever. And then that digital footprint often actually cascades into what becomes a media footprint, where the media decides to take whatever that story was that started as a mobbing in the workplace and not only report on it, but often embellish it, often portray it in a way that wasn't even about where it started, and it creates a narrative effect that for the rest of your life you have, and you just cannot change it. But at the root of it is a mobbing that takes place, and that just simply, again, cascades, explodes, expands to the public. And that public exposure is simply like being dragged into the town square, but in a way that is now not only your town, it is a global being dragged in, because anyone at any point when they either see your name, Google you, or look at even the news that's coming out, all of a sudden you're there. So you've gone from the workplace to the town square to this global exposure that is just beyond devastating in ways that you can't imagine. So the real impetus for workplace mobbing is really where it all starts.
We've talked a lot about the processes that underlie workplace mobbings and the patterns. And maybe it's our background in sports, but the word that Dave used that I've gone into is that we've often talked about the playbooks. So particularly on this transition from workplace mobbing to cancellation via the media, Dave, can you talk about some of these patterns, the elements of the playbook for whether it's the social media mob, the digital media mob, or just that one person that it can get it into, or take it out of the workplace and into society?
Yes, I can. I might move around. I get a little fidgety. I also have a prop. We can't use PowerPoint, but I wouldn't be much of a coach if I couldn't manage the clock. Is this on? Is that on? Yeah. So to me, it's a threshold issue. Probably here, I'm kind of the least academically credentialed and qualified in the room. I'm a field worker. And after my experience, and it was bad. There's lots we could talk about there. But in the process of moving forward, I just started reaching out to people. I see them in the news, in the media. I would try to track down an email. I'd try to find through a friend of a friend a somebody and get a text. Sometimes I write an actual physical card and stick a stamp on it, and I'd launch it off. And most of the time I wouldn't hear anything back, but sometimes I would. And it turns out if you do that for 7 years, you end up talking to a lot of people. So my N would be about 45 now. As George led off with saying, each person's pain is unique to them. But there are some real common patterns to it. The playbook, we've started to call it, patterns was mentioned yesterday. So those first conversations I have with people, I'm able to sort of predict some things. Some don't sound like a big deal, but you will get bad news on Friday afternoon. That's not 100% consistent, but that's what it happens. That's somebody dropping a shit bomb on you so they don't have to deal with it over the weekend. You do, and you don't know what's been said. I wasn't sure I was going to say this until Steve said it this morning. HR is not your friend. I hate to be that blunt about it. Your union rep is not your guy. I have never run into one case yet where anybody has said, my rep, great person. They saved me. I've still got my job. Never happens. So those patterns lead to an identification of thresholds. And the first one we've talked about here was where it moves from an office to the office. And then there's the office to the institution. So if you're in academics, that's probably departmental level to the institutional level. And that's where the clampdown starts happening. So in my case, it was in the form of a no contact directive. I was working one afternoon, and then I was sent home, and I was told that I couldn't talk to anybody, anywhere, anytime. They couldn't talk to me. If I ran into the grocery store, I was supposed to head the other direction. That just got the rumor mill going. You're there one day, and I was quite known on the campus I worked at, and then you're gone. So rumors start. And then in terms of what we're talking about, there's the escape velocity that happens when it gets out in public. A rumor goes out on social, and then it just goes like that, like wildfire. The institution loses jurisdiction. Whatever they had is gone. In my case and many others, mainstream media grabbed it. Michael talked about it. They distort it. One outlet for me just added an S in. Things became multiples. And it was like a whack-a-mole. I had a lawyer. I'm like, they can't do that. So they'd publish a retraction. That would cost a few $1,000s in legal work. They publish a retraction. It would get buried in the news media. People don't remember any of that stuff. So it goes on and on and on. And I'm appreciative of the comments that I've heard from other people here. Catherine, you talking about CBT and cognitive therapy not always being great in these cases. True, in my experience. Anne-Marie, you talked about the after. And when it gets out in the media and the public like that, there's an after the after. And it just goes on. It's chronic. It gets into your house. So I was socially in lockdown for months. It could still get in. Every time I turned on my computer or my phone, there was a possibility that I would be in the news. And it really happened. You only need it to happen 2 or 3 times before that becomes a pattern. So I'll wind down with that. But I do want to say one thing a little optimistically here. These are choices. You know, it gets out of control from the institution, but these are people making choices, which mean it can be changed. And we're a loose collective here, but we are a collective. So that means we can identify our own patterns and our own thresholds. One for me at a field level is awareness. When I talk to somebody, the first thing is, you're not alone. And those things you think you're thinking that nobody's ever thought before, you're not alone. You do become unglued and lose grip on reality. I totally started, like Christine is saying, believing things that were untrue. Completely started kind of going, it must be true if everybody's saying it. The awareness leads to support. That's kind of where I'm at right now. I hope support leads to advocacy, because that's when change really starts to happen. Advocacy can lead to something where we see real system change. Whatever comes out of this conference, I don't know. Ching-Li, you're writing about it. You started talking about a journal of mobbing. I'm going to cut it down there. But I really, as difficult as it's been and can be ongoing, I've met some incredible people. Incredible, like honest, kind, generous, forgiving. So hopefully we feel that in the room here. And that's my time right now.
And we're going to bring in Jonah now, because Dave talked about some of, the legal aspects, the legal advice that you get. Something that he and I have spoken about before is when we now speak to counseled people early in their cancellation journey, their workplace mobbing journey, the first piece of advice we often say is, get yourself a lawyer. And they say, why? I've done nothing wrong. And it's like, that's not the point. So to talk about some of the legal issues that have been encountered in these settings, Jonah Arnold, who has done extensive work in workplace law, particularly in regulated professions in Ontario, to talk about some of the legal aspects that he has worked through, as well as the state of the law that he's been in now.
Thank you. I just want to make sure you can hear me. Perfect. Thanks for inviting me, and apologies for not being there in person. I am indeed in Copenhagen and trying to desperately keep my eyes open because it's about 6 hours later here. I'll do my best. I think in listening to the comments just now, the first thing I want to share is the universality of what's being said here. I see this so commonly, so often, across all professions that I deal with, across all my clients. I regularly deal with 26 allied health professionals, from doctors to dentists. You name the health profession, I deal with them, and with a variety of other regulated and non-regulated professions, and it is universal. The thing that I can share is that the process is quite often punitive, and those conducting the process don't seem to recognize the level of frankly, punishment that is meted out just through the process alone. I've prepared a few comments, and I'll work through them here. In my experience, most workplace harassment systems are built around a very simple structure. A complainant reports harm, an employer investigates, and the person accused is treated as a respondent. It's a setup right from the beginning. And as a lawyer, I would argue that the structure is necessary because employers have to identify genuine harassment and have to do so in an environment without retaliation. But the system has by nature some serious blind spots. And one of those is that the person, as you know, the person who files a complaint may not be a victim. And the complaint itself may be an instrument of harassment. And this is what I deal with very commonly. This is a very important point, and it's that the complainant should not be presumed to be legally truthful. The descriptor of complainant and respondent should be a procedural description, but oftentimes what comes with that description are biases and prejudgments, and that's more than unfortunate. In any event, the employer is obligated to appropriately and impartially investigate, but that takes time, and by the time the investigation has started, there are, as others have mentioned, grumblings behind the scene, rumors start, and there is a casting of judgment outside of the official process. And what I would call a procedural mobbing ensues. So while it's workplace or employment mobbing, I would call it procedural mobbing as well. And so one individual, in my experience, would create a narrative about a target, and they recruit colleagues, and the playbook is fairly well known. And the employer typically acts defensively. They're primarily concerned about protecting themselves from criticism and failing to respond. And often the safest institutional decision appears to be taking action against the accused person. And in my experience with regulated folks, there's a split. There's two aspects. There's the employer's investigation, and then the employer files what we call in Ontario a mandatory report, and I suspect it's something similar in New York. The employer then files with the regulator, that's the institution handing out the licenses to practice in a regulated field. They file a mandatory report, and the regulator then has to deal with the mandatory report. They're supposed to investigate neutrally. They're supposed to take it as a tip of information, but oftentimes we see that the institution, their mandatory report is often taken as fact, or if not given tremendous weight. And so what we start to see is a piling on, first by the employer, then by the regulator. And this is exceedingly detrimental. I get the phone call at some point, and I'm asked to do, frankly, the impossible. I'm asked to legally defend somebody, to tease the truth out, convince people of the truth when they've been convinced through other informal mechanisms of some alternate version of the truth, I will call it. So I'd like to describe a client of mine, anonymized, and my client is a regulated health professional. Several colleagues submitted complaints within several days of each other, and some of the allegations were said to have occurred 7 years earlier. So imagine all of a sudden the recipient of the complaint, my client, learns that allegedly things that he said or did 7 years earlier are problematic. The timing, the similarities surrounding the communications, they raised serious concerns. The complainants had discussed and aligned their accounts. And the age of the complaint itself is problematic because witnesses have disappeared, records no longer exist, and so forth. Context, frankly, has been lost. And then in that context, the employer turned around and filed a mandatory report. And so a second investigation ensued. And I guess what I'm not asking here is for anybody to, if you knew the facts, to decide on the facts, but to think about the process and think about, from a legal perspective, what we're up against. It's just a setup for failure from the beginning. And I don't mean to be pessimistic about it, but realistic about the mountain of allegations that layer on top of each other that we have to deal with. The harm is not confined in the legal system to money, to monetary damages. And as you've all discussed, everything from professional stigma to lost referrals, impaired employment prospects, you name it. We're asked to deal with that as lawyers, and we're asked, of course, to manage our clients' expectations. It's a tall order.
Jonah, I'm just going to jump in real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, and Christine, a lot of what Jonah is talking about in the last couple of minutes was the development of a narrative. I mean, what he laid out just now was how institutional processes lay the groundwork. They set the story that then goes from his arcane world of workplace law into the New York Times, into the Globe and Mail. And he said earlier, he used the phrase instrument of harassment. The narrative itself and the media become instruments of harassment. So can you kind of explore some of those issues for us, please?
When you see yourself in a certain way, I mean, that's your identity, and there's something called the narrative identity, which has a continuity to it. You know, this is what happened in my life, and then that happened, and then that happened. This is my life purpose. So we form our identities in part by the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell others and the stories that others tell about us. So you think of yourself as a boss who has always worried about the welfare of your employees and has always wanted to be inclusive and was highly involved in philanthropy. So you see yourself as a good person and you live that way. Now this narrative is stripped from you publicly, and as I said earlier, when you hear or see thousands of people saying that you are this person that you are not, it is very confusing to your sense of self about who you are. And even though you know it, that's the paradox about humiliation. Humiliation is when you're publicly stripped of your status and you're misrepresented in some way. And humiliation, with that emotion, there's always a sense of unfairness, injustice. So you know that what's being said is false, but at the same time, a part of you is doing this self-excavation and saying, is there any part of this that's true? I mean, did I not realize this about myself? So your identity gets fractured. And when it gets bad enough, there's something that happens called narrative foreclosure. And it usually happens with, say, the elderly in hospice. They know that their life is coming to an end and there will be no future chapters, and they prepare for the end. Narrative closure should not be happening to a healthy person in their 30s or 40s, but when you, or 50s or whenever, somebody that is not on their deathbed should be living a vibrant life. But when you have this happen to your identity, your sense of self, you are now grieving the death of who you thought you were, who you used to be. The grieving is so deep, and it's sort of a disenfranchised grief because people don't recognize it as, I mean, why are you grieving about what your life was a year ago? You still live in the same spot, you know, but it's a very deep grief, and it's narrative foreclosure is a scary thing for somebody to be going through because it means most likely that they're now in a situation of suicidal ideation.
One other thing that Jonah spoke about was, you know, these allegations that go back, 7 years. And in my work, I've had stories of people who are counseled based on allegations going back 20, 30, 50 years. But, in the context of workplace mobbing, there is a sort of time limit on how much of your life they can erase, because it typically refers to your employment at that position, at that job. So for someone who was tenured at the same place for a long time, like Dave was, but also for other people where, again, when it gets to the media and it leaves the workplace, it's not just overwriting your LinkedIn profile. It's overwriting everything that comes before it. And it's not just about your job performance in the last fiscal quarter of the last year, but it takes away the previous 25 years. So Dave, can you just kind of speak a little bit about that, since as a coach, we're defined by the legacies of our athletes, decades of athletes, and then all of a sudden that gets vanished, that gets overwritten in a second, because what started as the narrative in the workplace mobbing now becomes the media's definition of who this gentleman is.
Yeah, I'll try to get a handle on it. Before I went through it, I would not have thought the psychological damage would be as extreme as it is from being erased. And I realize that a lot of people that I've talked to now, well-intentioned people, would say that must have been a bad time. You got fired, probably a bad week, maybe a bad month, and then you got another job and you move on. And this stuff's like napalm. And it can come into my life anytime, from any angle. And then there was an element of, I want to say it in the right way. It wasn't about status that I had from winning awards and being in record books, but the opposite sure caused a lot of harm. There's just blank spaces where I used to be. And in athletics, my institution actually just took statistics from me, erased me, and assigned them to other people in terms of titles won. So those people have these records up here right now. And it just honestly fucked my head up, like drastically for a long time. It still does. Like, why would you do that? I can't imagine being on the other side of the equation and saying, you're going to give me Christine's stats? Okay, that makes me like it just... So I'll cut it off there because I can get emotional about it. It's that type of narrative foreclosure. It's an erasure, and it is complete obliteration of whatever identity I had. Not even statistically. I just mean in terms of relationships with other people. I'm invisible. And this is the first time I've had a voice in 7 years, to be honest, and it scares the hell out of me.
If I could, I think one of the things we really don't understand is what starts as a workplace mobbing, and some folks talked about it on other panels. An organization just tends to abandon those people when someone is brought up. And what you need most is the organization support, the organization that has trusted you, the organization that has hired you, that has supported you, that has celebrated you. And they just disappear. And the mobbing then seems to get more impetus when that happens, because they see that happening, and then it erodes any kind of trust that you have. And so the people, whether it's your board, whether it's your coworkers, your colleagues, all of a sudden you feel like they're on with the mob. And then it just seems to, again, explode. So one of the things I heard earlier on the panel is the real importance for organizations to understand the severity of this and the lack of humanity that's sometimes shown to someone from their organization. So when the mob comes, they tend to take the organization down too. And that is destructive across the board, whereas the organization should rightfully pause and look at things differently. And I know Christine has a lot of recommendations, and she's done a whole dissertation on what organizations can do in order to change the tide of this. Someone said earlier that they need one person. Well, that one person should be the organization to really take the mob, stop the mob, and try to cause some redirection for how this is looked at. And that's one of the things with awareness that we really need to bring to organizations as well.
And I think one aspect of that, Michael, specifically with your story, you had a good relationship with the media that ultimately canceled you. So on top of the other institutions that weren't there for you and the individuals that pushed you off the ledge, the media was just one more knife in your back. You had those relationships.
Everyone's going into the town square to see you get buried. I mean, that's just what it becomes. When the mobbing is really what starts it, but then everyone's walking into that town square and they all want to see you laying on the ground or having something happen to you for whatever reason. That is what happens. And it's tough to change that tide. I think someone said that earlier. Once that tide starts, it's really hard to stop it.
And, I think, it raises another question, as a profession that hasn't come up as much so far, is the media. Now, Michael was the CEO of a major sports and entertainment company. Dave was a very successful head coach. When, them getting relieved or fired from their jobs could be newsworthy. But when we report on it, we make it something different. When is a workplace mobbing newsworthy? It is an event that may be affecting a university, a major nonprofit, but it's kind of like the whole Schrodinger's cat thing, that the workplace mobbing is there, but once we notice that it's there, those of us in the media who have a public platform, well, now it's no longer workplace mobbing, it's a cancellation. So there is that element of recognizing when is it newsworthy, but by making it news, we make it something different. And then we create the scenarios that we're in right now. David, you have something you wanted to add just briefly?
Just following up on Michael briefly, we'll move to questions. We're running out of time. It doesn't just hit the person that it hits. And I think that needs to be said. This hit my wife. This hit 3 teenage daughters. This hit nieces and nephews. I did have a few people that were courageous enough to speak up. They got eviscerated publicly. Eviscerated. Like, I talked to people that were in tears. They were psychologically destroyed just for saying, "Hey, now let's talk about it." So the blast radius from this stuff is pretty huge. It affects families and communities.
If I could add something very quickly, almost every client that comes to me asks for justice, and I ask them what that means to them. Justice is elusive, I will say.
Yeah, Christine said to me early on, what you have to do is you have to form the counter narrative, and I think you should explain how you can do that publicly.
Could we get questions, please? We just want to make sure we have enough time for an opportunity. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. On now? Yeah.
Yes.
And thank you, and I'm so sorry for the pain that all of you and all of us have been through in different ways. But I have a question, and then I'll read one from the chat, because I've got the chat. I know when it comes to the media, there are standards, like for juveniles, for example. If there are juveniles who've been involved in there's some kind of legal case, the media will, they'll protect, they won't release their identity. Like, it's a rule, right? To protect them. And so I don't know if there's any possible standards when something's being resolved, because the people are getting tried in the court of public opinion, right? So that's one of the problems. So I was just wanting some comment on or guidance on that. And then Peter Wiley asked a question. Do you know of the cases of Francis Widdowson in Alberta and Stephen Galloway in BC?
I can do a quick on both of those. I had a very good defamation lawyer during my stuff, and at one point I said, this has to be, let's just tell the truth. I'm not afraid of that. I can be accountable for the truth. And he said, I want you to listen very carefully. The truth doesn't matter. And you want to talk about an existential crisis, and it's what Jonah was saying about justice. He was like, I'm here to protect you. The truth doesn't matter. And yeah, I'm very familiar with the cases that Peter's talking about at a 1 degree of separation level.
And, I think just real quick, Dave, one other thing you share with me from your lawyer is basically saying you can file a defamation suit, but it's going to cost you a lot of money, and you're not going to win much at the judgment, and you're going to look like a jerk for doing it. So it kind of disincentivizes you.
He's a good guy, and he did what a good lawyer does too. He was psychologically protective, and one of his things to me was, if you want me to do this, we'll win. Here's why you shouldn't do it. But one of those is, you're just not tough enough, And he was right. He's like, this is going to be a slugfest for a couple of years. What are you going to get out of it?
Rick Peltz?
Great real world advice.
Was there another question? Can we get the microphone up to the back, please?
Sorry, yeah.
I think you made a comment or suggestion that there should be, or rather, there should not be an assumption of veracity of the complainant. how would that work? I mean, I'm not questioning it, really. I just want an explanation of how effective you think that would be. And would there be any other complementary measures that you would add on to that? How would it work?
I think that was Jonah.
Yeah, that's for Jonah.
The difficulty is when multiple complainants link up their stories, and whether they do that purposely or they do that inadvertently, it is incumbent on whoever's investigating to recognize that just because you have multiple complainants that may have similar stories does not mean that that is credible or actually evidence that can be relied upon. So ultimately, it's just about conducting an investigation that understands, frankly, the rules of evidence. When institutions conduct investigations, they should be getting legal assistance. They should be treating those that are innocent as innocent. And the parties should be on equal footing. Unfortunately, it just doesn't happen, in my experience.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I have a question about, do you have any advice for when mobbing is happening and it hasn't hit the media yet? Are there things that a person can do or that we could advise a person to do, to take preventive action?
Anybody want to?
Christine, I think you're probably best.
Well, am I on? Hello?
Yeah, you're good.
Well, I mean, if there is a possibility of going to that key person that can make a change, start privately. I always say if somebody has an issue with someone else, if the goal is change, then conversations can happen. But if the goal is not really change, they won't meet with you anyway. The goal is to get that dopamine rush of feeling superior to you and attack you, then that's a whole different animal. Like people will go online and demand somebody get fired or something happen, but they never had a personal conversation to describe what the problem was. And there's a real insincerity, and that's an example of, to me, what Jonah said, that you vet the individual to see if their motivation really is to create change or not. And that's the first step. I mean, there's a million things you could do. It's also important to get your true narrative to the right people and be ready in case it does go public.
Yes, I know Maritza has a lot of comments and questions, but Maritza, maybe you could write one short question in the chat, and I'll read it out. And in the meantime, Sandy Kuritzin has a comment or a question in the chat for Jonah. When complainants hook up their stories, why is that not called collusion, especially when the truth does come out because there were records?
I mean, it's a good point. It's referred to as corroboration, not collusion, wrongly so. I really don't have anything to add to that. It's a good point.
I do. Am I on? Thank you. So I have a colleague who is going through the situation where there is corroboration, but the truth is, they have all the receipts and they have done nothing wrong, and the corroboration is now being sued as a civil conspiracy. Yeah, and the goal of that civil conspiracy was to destroy this person who is a competitor to one of them.
I should add that the causes of action in civil court that exist, there's been many attempts in Canada, some in the States I'm aware of as well, to create a tort, which is a civil wrong, a tort of mobbing, of harassment. And the courts in both countries have said, no, we've got enough areas of law to cover this. Unfortunately, it isn't a distinct area at this point.
All right, thank you. We need to cut it off right now, so if we could, we'll take the online questions however we can get them, and we can respond to people over email or some other way, and obviously, we'll be happy to speak to the audience here, but we need to wrap up.